The void of space stretched out, an endless sea of stars, black and cold. Yet deep within this dark expanse, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. Space raiders, a ruthless and cunning race, had roamed the stars for centuries, plundering, conquering, and exploring the farthest reaches of the galaxy. They had encountered countless alien species, traded with advanced civilizations, and learned the ways of the universe. But despite all their knowledge, one mystery remained unsolved: humanity. The humans had always fascinated them. Unlike any other species the raiders had come across, humans had one strange habit, something that set them apart from every other race in the galaxy. Human ships always traveled alone. It was a peculiar thing, one that had puzzled the raiders for years. They observed human ships from afar, noting how they operated in isolation, always single, never part of a greater fleet. Most species, even the most powerful, understood the value of alliances, of forming fleets to protect and defend each other. But the humans? They seemed to have no need for help. No large armies, no powerful armadas, just single, solitary ships traveling the vastness of space, as if they were unconcerned with the dangers lurking in the darkness. The raiders, for all their wisdom and strength, couldn't understand it. They had conquered countless planets and had seen civilizations rise and fall, yet never before had they encountered a species so strange, so unpredictable. The human ships weren't particularly large or intimidating, and their technology wasn't the most advanced. At least, that's what the raiders thought. They had assumed that humans were weak, just another species to be dismissed. But the more the raiders observed, the more their curiosity grew. There had to be more to these humans than met the eye. Why didn't they travel with others? Why did they never group together like every other species? Was it arrogance? Or was there something more? Something hidden? The more the raiders watched, the more they realized they had underestimated humanity. They weren't just any species. They were different. But what made them so unique? What was the secret they were hiding? This question burned in the minds of the raiders as they prepared to uncover the truth behind the mysterious human way of life. They had to know what made these humans so confident, so self-sufficient. They needed to understand why human ships always traveled alone. And more importantly, what could possibly be so dangerous about them that made them do so? As the raiders readied their ships and prepared to dive deeper into the mystery of humanity, a strange feeling lingered in the air, a sense of dread mixed with excitement. They were about to learn something that would shake the very foundation of their understanding of the galaxy. What they didn't know was that this discovery would change everything for them, for humanity, and for the future of the universe itself. And so, as the dark ships of the raiders cut through the blackness of space, a new chapter in their story began, one they could never have predicted. The silence of space was broken only by the hum of their engines as they drew closer to their target, the Earth. From their vantage point, the planet was beautiful, a blue jewel in the cold vastness of space. But it wasn't the planet that interested them. It was the human ships, the way they moved through space like lone wolves, always on their own, always apart from the rest of the galaxy. The raiders had watched them for years from the shadows, but they hadn't yet dared to confront them. Now, though, they had made the decision. It was time to face humanity and uncover the truth once and for all. The raiders' ship shuddered slightly as it entered Earth's orbit, its sensors scanning the planet below. In the distance, they saw a human vessel, small but resolute, cruising silently through the void. It was like all the others they had seen, a single ship, alone in the vast emptiness. No fleet, no protection. The raiders couldn't fathom it. What were the humans thinking? As they prepared to make their move, the raiders couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. There was something about this that felt different. They had faced many species in their time, but this was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The human ships might have seemed insignificant, but the raiders had learned never to underestimate their enemies. The more they looked, the more they saw something that disturbed them, a sense of quiet power emanating from the humans and their ships. And as they readied themselves to engage, they had no idea that they were about to discover a truth so dark, so powerful, that it would forever change the course of their lives. There was no turning back now. The raiders were committed, ready to finally uncover the mystery of why human ships traveled alone. What they would soon learn would send shockwaves through the galaxy, for humanity was not the weak, insignificant species they had assumed. The humans had been hiding something, a secret so dangerous that the galaxy had no idea what was coming. The raiders had no idea that by the time they uncovered the truth, they would already be too late. With their weapons primed and their sensors focused, the raiders advanced on the lone human ship. It floated in the darkness like an unassuming target. But the raiders were wrong. The human ship wasn't just another victim waiting to be plundered. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the galaxy, one the raiders would never have imagined. As the raiders closed in, the question that had plagued them for so long finally had an answer, but it wasn't the one they had expected. The truth would come, but it would bring with it a shock so deep that they would question everything they thought they knew about power, survival, and the true nature of humanity. And so, the story of the space raiders and the humans began. A story of discovery, danger, and an awakening that would forever change the galaxy. The raiders' ships hovered in the darkness of space, their sleek and imposing forms blending into the shadows. The cold, infinite expanse stretched out in every direction, and yet it felt like the space around them was somehow charged with anticipation. For centuries, the raiders had been the most feared species in the galaxy, conquering planets and unraveling the secrets of the universe. They had encountered beings of all kinds, each with their own unique strengths and weaknesses. But one species had eluded their understanding: humanity. Humans were different. Unlike every other species the raiders had encountered, humans never traveled in groups. It was as though they had learned to be self-sufficient, relying only on themselves. It was this one strange behavior that had caught the attention of the raiders, and now it was all they could think about. Why? Why did the humans always travel alone? What was the secret behind their solitary ways? The question gnawed at them, its mystery slowly transforming into an obsession. There had to be something more to these humans, something they didn't know. The raiders had watched humanity for years from a distance, studying their behavior, their technology, their methods of exploration. They saw human ships traversing the stars, going from one planet to another, always as solitary vessels. No fleets, no alliances. The humans, despite their relatively modest ships and limited technology, appeared to be a force to be reckoned with. But the raiders couldn't put their finger on why. And that uncertainty, that unknown, gnawed at them like an itch that they couldn't scratch. At first, they had believed that humans were simply too weak or disorganized to form fleets. But as the years passed and the raiders observed more, they realized their initial assumption had been wrong. The humans were far more capable than they had given them credit for. The ships they piloted were far more advanced than they had appeared at first glance. The technology they used was beyond anything the raiders had seen before, and it hinted at an intelligence and resilience that the raiders hadn't anticipated. The raiders' curiosity grew with each passing day. They knew that to understand humanity, they needed to get closer. They needed to learn more about these strange, solitary beings. They had seen the human ships alone in the vast emptiness of space, navigating hostile environments and surviving in ways that seemed almost impossible. What were the humans preparing for? What did they know that the raiders did not? There was one human ship in particular that had caught the raiders' attention. It was an unassuming craft, seemingly ordinary and unremarkable. The raiders had watched it for weeks as it made its journey through the stars, moving through dangerous territories without any support. It was like all the others, a lone vessel, just one human ship against the great unknown. It was almost as if the humans weren't afraid of what lurked in the dark corners of space. The decision was made. The raiders would investigate. They would board the human ship and learn the truth. They would finally discover why these humans, of all species, refused to join forces with anyone else. And so, with a sense of quiet determination, the raiders prepared to descend upon the human ship. The tension was palpable as the raiders' ships descended toward Earth's orbit, their dark silhouettes cutting through the stars like shadows. From this vantage point, Earth looked like a beautiful and peaceful planet, a soft blue marble floating in the void of space. But it wasn't the planet that intrigued the raiders. It was the humans, their ships, and the mystery that surrounded them. The raiders had studied humanity for so long from afar, but now they were about to come face to face with their enigma. And they were prepared to uncover the secret that had eluded them for so long. The human ship appeared in the distance, its form sleek and simple against the blackness of space. It was exactly as the raiders had expected, lonely and alone. There was no fleet to accompany it, no backup. It was just one human ship, navigating through space like it had done countless times before. The raiders moved in closer, their ships surrounding the lone vessel. It was time to find out what made the humans so different. Time to uncover the secret they had been hiding. The raiders prepared to board the human ship. There was no fear in their movements, only cold efficiency. They had dealt with countless species before. And this would be no different, or so they thought. As they approached the human vessel, a strange feeling crept over them, an unexplainable sense of unease. It wasn't something they could put their finger on, but it was there. It felt like they were walking into something far larger than they could comprehend. They boarded the ship, weapons in hand, and began their investigation. At first, they didn't find anything unusual. The human ship was empty, seemingly abandoned. But as they moved deeper into the vessel, they began to find signs of life. Hidden compartments, cryptic symbols, and strange, unfamiliar technology. The raiders were baffled. What was this? Why had the humans hidden these things on their ship? What were they preparing for? As they continued to explore, they came across a strange room deep within the ship. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before. There, hidden in the shadows, was the key to the mystery. The raiders found advanced technology, powerful weapons, shields, and devices far beyond anything they had ever encountered. This was not a ship of a weak species. This was a ship of survival, of strength. The humans had not been alone in space out of weakness, but out of necessity. They had been preparing for something far worse than anything the raiders could imagine. The realization hit them like a shockwave. The humans weren't weak. They weren't unprepared. They had been ready for something. But what? The raiders' minds raced as they tried to comprehend the implications of their discovery. The truth was slowly unraveling, but it only raised more questions. What was this force that the humans had been preparing for? What kind of threat was so powerful that it forced humans to work alone, to hide their greatest secrets away from the rest of the galaxy? The answer, the raiders realized, was not something they could uncover in a single moment. The mystery of humanity was deep, far deeper than they could have ever imagined. And as they stood in the darkened room of the human ship, they knew that they had only scratched the surface of a much greater truth. The questions that lingered would haunt them, and they would not stop until they discovered the full extent of humanity's power. You said, as the raiders explored the human vessel further, the mysteries only deepened. Their initial belief that the humans were just another weak and insignificant species was quickly shattered. Every step they took uncovered something new, something that didn't fit into the neat little box they had placed humanity in. They had expected to find a simple, unguarded ship, easy to plunder. Instead, they found something far more unsettling, something that hinted at a quiet, hidden strength beneath the surface. The walls of the ship, though simple in design, were laced with intricate markings, symbols the raiders couldn't decipher, but felt strangely familiar. The raiders had encountered many forms of alien art and technology throughout their campaigns, but this was different. It was as if the ship was alive, breathing with hidden purpose, whispering secrets that they couldn't yet grasp. It was almost as if the ship itself was built to protect something, something important. They moved deeper into the vessel, bypassing storage rooms and corridors that seemed abandoned. But the deeper they went, the more they felt that something, or someone, was still hiding within the ship. It wasn't just a ship at all. It was a fortress of knowledge, a repository of humanity's darkest secrets. The deeper they explored, the more they realized that humanity had been preparing for something far worse than the raiders had anticipated. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a symbol of survival. At the heart of the ship, they found what they had been searching for. The center of the vessel was unlike anything the raiders had ever seen. It was a chamber filled with advanced technology, alien to the raiders' understanding, surrounded by enormous, impenetrable walls of solid metal. The room felt cold, yet there was a strange warmth to it, an energy that emanated from the walls themselves, as if the entire room was charged with purpose. As the raiders entered the chamber, they saw it, a weapon unlike any other. Its design was sleek, yet its power radiated an ominous, almost otherworldly aura. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool of destruction, a defense mechanism of unimaginable force. The raiders knew that this wasn't just some advanced piece of technology. This was humanity's answer to something greater, something they had been preparing for, perhaps for centuries. They tried to understand the purpose of the weapon, but they quickly realized they weren't equipped to comprehend its true nature. The humans had created this device not for conquest, but for survival. It wasn't meant to fight other species or to conquer the stars. It was meant to protect humanity from something far darker, something lurking in the unknown reaches of space. The raiders felt the weight of this realization hit them hard. They had come expecting to find weak, unprepared humans. Instead, they had found a species that had not only survived the galaxy's harshest challenges, but had also prepared itself for a future threat that no one had yet seen. The truth, as the raiders began to understand, was far more complex than they had ever imagined. Humans hadn't been avoiding alliances because they were incapable of making them. They had been avoiding alliances because they had been preparing for something that required them to be alone. They had been hiding their greatest strengths from the rest of the galaxy, knowing that they couldn't trust anyone to stand with them against the coming storm. The raiders stood in silence as they looked at the weapon, the cold reality of what they had uncovered settling in. They had underestimated humanity in every possible way. They had assumed that humans were weak, easy prey. But in reality, humans had been preparing for something far beyond their understanding. And now, the raiders were in the midst of it. As they turned to leave the chamber, a sense of unease lingered in the air. What had the humans been preparing for? What was coming? The raiders had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was clear. Humanity was far more dangerous than they had ever realized. And now that they had discovered the weapon, the truth about the humans' solitary nature, they had to wonder what else was hidden out there. What other secrets were humanity keeping? The raiders' minds raced as they moved quickly through the ship, gathering data, trying to piece together the fragments of what they had uncovered. They had to leave before the humans returned, before they could reveal the true extent of their power. But as they left the ship, the mystery of humanity lingered in their minds. They knew that they had only scratched the surface of what the humans were capable of. The truth was much darker, much more dangerous than they could ever have imagined. As the raiders' ships pulled away from the human vessel and began their journey back into deep space, the lingering question burned in their minds. What was the true nature of the threat humanity had been preparing for? They had underestimated them before, but now they knew they had to be prepared for the worst. The galaxy was changing, and humanity was at the center of it all. The raiders had discovered a truth that no one else had known, and it was a truth that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Humanity was not the weak, disorganized species they had thought. No, the humans were much more. And the raiders would soon find out just how dangerous that could be. As the raiders' ships distanced themselves from the human vessel, a strange sense of urgency filled the cold silence of space. The initial shock of their discovery had begun to wear off, but the weight of it still lingered heavy and oppressive. What they had uncovered on that ship was more than just technology or weapons. It was a warning, a message that humanity had been preparing for something far beyond what the raiders could imagine. The mystery deepened with every passing moment, and yet the raiders couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed something crucial, something important that could change everything. They had thought they understood the galaxy. For centuries, the raiders had been the hunters, the predators, the ones who knew the rules of survival better than anyone. They had studied every species, every weapon, every planet they had conquered or encountered. They had thought they knew what to expect. But humanity, with its solitary ships and hidden strength, had shattered their assumptions. The raiders were no longer certain of anything. In the days that followed, the raiders spent hours poring over the data they had taken from the human ship. They analyzed the weapon they had found, attempting to decipher its true purpose. But even their most brilliant minds couldn't unlock its full potential. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. There were no blueprints, no instructions, no manuals. The technology was so advanced, so alien, that the raiders could only guess at its true power. One thing was clear, though. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a shield, a defense mechanism designed to protect humanity from an incoming threat. As the raiders debated their next move, their thoughts kept returning to the same question. What had the humans been preparing for? The weapon, the advanced technology. It all pointed to a single conclusion. Humanity was expecting something. But what? Who? And why? The raiders knew that the galaxy was vast and full of unknown dangers. But even in the darkest corners of space, there were few things that could truly challenge their power. They had seen it all: the wars, the destruction, the endless battles for dominance. But nothing had ever made them feel as uneasy as the human ship, the weapon, and the strange emptiness surrounding humanity's secrets. With this newfound knowledge, the raiders made a decision. They would return to the human ship, take more data, and find out everything they could. They couldn't afford to ignore what they had uncovered. If the humans were preparing for something, then the raiders needed to be ready. But as they prepared for the next phase of their investigation, a sense of dread grew among them. The questions about the human ship, the weapon, and the silent, solitary nature of humanity were no longer just questions. They were a ticking clock. The raiders could feel it in their bones. Time was running out. The journey back to the human ship was filled with tension. The cold void of space stretched out before them, but this time, the raiders were no longer so certain of their own superiority. The familiar arrogance that had always guided them now seemed out of place. They were no longer just hunters. Now, they were the ones being hunted, by a force they couldn't even fully comprehend. When they arrived at the human ship once more, the raiders were prepared for anything, or so they thought. They had come back in greater numbers this time, bringing reinforcements and new equipment to help them probe the ship's deeper secrets. They quickly docked and made their way into the heart of the vessel, scanning every inch with new equipment and more advanced sensors. But despite their efforts, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. Something vital, something crucial. And then, as they ventured deeper into the vessel once again, they came across something they hadn't noticed before: a hidden room, tucked away behind layers of thick metal walls. This was no ordinary room. It was unlike anything they had seen on the ship during their previous exploration. The walls were lined with symbols, just as before, but this time, the symbols seemed to pulse with an eerie light, as though they were alive. The raiders entered the room cautiously, weapons at the ready, their every instinct telling them that something was wrong. The air inside was heavy, charged with an energy that they couldn't explain. They could feel it, a vibration in the air, like the ship itself was holding its breath. In the center of the room was a large, glass-like structure, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with their own heartbeats. As they approached the structure, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. One of the raiders stepped forward, reaching out to touch the surface of the glowing object. The moment their hand made contact, the entire ship seemed to shudder. The raiders looked around in alarm as a low hum filled the room, and the walls of the chamber began to shift. The symbols on the walls flickered and changed, rearranging themselves in a pattern that was now unmistakable. It was a message. The raiders stood frozen as the words began to form, one by one, across the glowing surface. The message was simple but terrifying. The war has already begun. The raiders stared at the message in disbelief. The war? What war? They had assumed the humans were merely preparing for something. They never imagined they were already involved in a conflict, one that had been brewing in the dark corners of the galaxy, far beyond their reach. It was then that the realization hit them like a wave of cold water. The humans weren't preparing for a distant, vague threat. They were already in the midst of something much larger, something that the galaxy had no idea was even happening, and they were doing it alone. As the raiders continued to decipher the message, the gravity of the situation sank in. The humans had been preparing for this war for centuries, perfecting their technology, hiding their greatest weapons, and training themselves for an enemy they couldn't trust anyone else to fight. And now, the raiders understood the truth. They were not the ones who were about to invade Earth. They were the ones about to be caught in the crossfire of a much larger, far more dangerous conflict. The raiders had been so focused on the humans' isolation, their solitary nature, that they had missed the bigger picture. The humans hadn't been hiding out of fear. They had been hiding out of necessity. They had known something that no one else had. The war had already begun. And humanity, for all its strength, had been preparing to face it alone. As the raiders turned and made their way out of the room, the sense of unease grew stronger. They had crossed a line. They had uncovered a truth that had been hidden from the galaxy for so long. And now, they knew they couldn't escape the consequences. The war was coming, and humanity had been ready for it all along. The raiders, for the first time in their lives, felt a deep, gnawing fear. They had entered the realm of the unknown, and they had no idea how to survive the coming storm. The raiders' ships soared through the darkness of space, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily on their shoulders. They had thought they understood the galaxy, thought they knew the rules and the players, but now everything had changed. Humanity, the species they had long considered weak and solitary, had revealed something far darker, something far more dangerous. The war that humanity had been preparing for was no longer a distant, abstract threat. It was real, and the raiders were now caught in its shadow. As they made their way back to their base, the raiders couldn't shake the images of the hidden room, the glowing message, and the eerie hum of the human ship. The words burned in their minds. The war has already begun. What did it mean? Who was the enemy? And why had the humans been keeping this secret for so long? The questions haunted them, but answers remained elusive. They knew they couldn't ignore what they had learned. Humanity wasn't just preparing for something. It was in the midst of a conflict that had already started. The technology, the weapons, the secrets on the ship, all pointed to a singular conclusion. Humanity was facing an enemy unlike any the raiders had ever encountered. The advanced weapon they had found on the human ship was not just for defense. It was a tool for survival, meant to protect them from a force that could wipe them out entirely. But the raiders didn't know who that enemy was. Back at their command center, the raiders gathered their leaders, their warlords, and the top strategists to discuss their next move. The information they had gathered was troubling. Humanity's weapons were unlike anything the raiders had ever seen. They were powerful, advanced, and highly efficient. But it was the secrecy that stood out the most. Why hadn't humanity shared its technology with the rest of the galaxy? Why had they chosen to go it alone? The raiders weren't the only ones who had noticed the shift in the human behavior. Rumors had begun to spread throughout the galaxy. Whispers of strange events, of planets under attack by an unknown force, of entire fleets disappearing without a trace. But no one had connected the dots until now. The truth was staring them in the face. Humanity had known about this threat for a long time. They had been preparing for it, silently gathering strength, and waiting for the moment when they would have to face it. And now, that moment was here. The Raiders were faced with a difficult decision. Should they continue with their plans to conquer humanity, now that they knew the humans were more powerful than they had ever imagined? Or should they try to understand what was really happening? Could they join forces with humanity, or would they become enemies in this greater war? The Raiders were not known for their diplomacy. They were conquerors, born and bred to dominate and control. But this situation was different. The discovery of humanity's preparations for war had put them in an unfamiliar position, one where they had to reconsider their next move carefully. The stakes had been raised, and the galaxy was no longer a predictable, controllable place. The Raiders realized they had no choice but to learn more, to understand the full scope of the threat humanity was facing. But this meant taking a risk, an enormous risk. The Raiders made the decision. They would attempt to make contact with humanity, not as conquerors, but as allies, or at least as neutral observers. They would find out exactly what the war was, who the humans were fighting, and whether there was a way they could work together to survive the impending disaster. However, even as the decision was made, doubt lingered. The Raiders had always been the hunters, the ones who controlled the fate of others. But now, they found themselves in an unfamiliar and unsettling role. They were no longer certain that they could simply steamroll their way through the galaxy. The war that humanity had been preparing for was something far beyond their understanding. If they were to join the humans in this conflict, it wouldn't be a battle of weapons. It would be a battle of survival. The weeks that followed were filled with tension. The Raiders attempted to establish communication with humanity, but the humans were cautious. They had made it clear that they were not interested in forming alliances with any species. They had been alone for so long, preparing for the war that was now upon them. And they trusted few. But the Raiders weren't willing to give up. They had to know more. They had to understand why humanity had prepared for this war, and how they could survive it. Slowly, the Raiders began to piece together the puzzle. The enemy humanity was facing was unlike anything they had ever seen. It wasn't a species, a single planet, or an army. It was an unstoppable force, an unknown entity that had been hunting down planets across the galaxy. Entire fleets had vanished without a trace, entire civilizations erased, as if they had never existed. It wasn't just a war, it was an extermination, and humanity, against all odds, had been preparing for it for centuries. The truth was more horrifying than the Raiders had imagined. Humanity was not just fighting for survival against a single enemy. They were fighting for the future of the entire galaxy, against an entity that threatened to wipe out all life in its path. The Raiders realized that they had made a grave mistake. They had thought humanity was weak, isolated, and unprepared. But now, they saw the truth. Humanity had been the only species preparing for the end of the galaxy as they knew it. They had been the only ones to recognize the threat in time. The realization hit the Raiders like a wave. They had underestimated humanity in every way possible. The war that was coming was not just about survival. It was about the fate of every species in the galaxy. The Raiders had been so focused on conquering and controlling that they had missed the bigger picture. Now they had to decide whether they would join humanity in the fight for survival, or remain enemies and risk being wiped out by this unknown force. The stakes had never been higher. The Raiders had always believed that they were the masters of the galaxy, but now they were faced with a truth they couldn't deny. The war had already begun, and humanity was the key to its outcome. The tension was palpable among the Raiders as they gathered in their war room, a place once dominated by their triumphant celebrations and tactical planning for their next conquests. Now it felt like a war council in preparation for something far more daunting, an enemy unlike any they had encountered. The truth was clear. They had underestimated humanity. This was no longer just about the fate of one planet or one species. This was about the survival of the entire galaxy. The decision to reach out to humanity had been made, but the risks were high. Trust didn't come easy for the raiders. For centuries, they had lived by the rule that the strong ruled, and the weak perished. Alliances were a tool for the momentary gains, but long-term alliances were a sign of vulnerability. The humans, isolated and secretive, had raised questions, but now, those questions were becoming dangerous. The raiders had learned too much. Now they had to choose whether to fight alongside the humans against the coming threat, or to face them as enemies. The command ship of the raider fleet glided silently through space, heading toward the coordinates that had been transmitted from the human vessel. The raiders had carefully selected their most trusted negotiators and tacticians for the meeting. The hope was that humanity, as cautious and self-reliant as they were, would see reason. The galaxy was on the brink of an extinction-level event, and the last thing anyone needed was another faction fighting for dominance when survival was the only goal. As they approached the human stronghold, a shroud of unease settled over the raiders. They had been in countless confrontations, each more intense and brutal than the last. But none of that mattered now. This was different. The humans weren't the same kind of opponent. They had not been trying to dominate or conquer. They had been preparing for something much larger. And now the raiders understood that they were no longer the predators. They were in the middle of something they couldn't predict, let alone control. The human station loomed ahead, an enormous, unyielding structure, silent and still. It wasn't like the ships of other species, adorned with colors or symbols of pride. This was a fortress, built for a singular purpose: survival. As the raiders docked their ships, their eyes scanned the perimeter. There was a tense, almost oppressive silence in the air, as if the very fabric of space was holding its breath. The door to the human station opened, and a group of human representatives stood waiting for them. Their demeanor was calm, but the tension in their eyes was unmistakable. They had been expecting the raiders. The message had already been received. Humanity was aware of the threat, and they had no delusions about the motivations of the raiders. The humans didn't want to fight, but they weren't afraid to do so if necessary. The leader of the raiders, a veteran commander named Derek, stepped forward. His armor gleamed in the dim light of the docking bay, his eyes hard with years of conquest and battle. He had been a predator for as long as he could remember. But now, standing face to face with humanity's leaders, he wasn't so sure about his place in the galaxy anymore. Humanity has been preparing for something, Derek said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his words. And we've come to understand that this war you've been fighting, it's bigger than anything we've ever seen. We want to know what you're up against. We want to fight with you. There was a pause, and for a moment, the humans did not respond. They exchanged glances, as if measuring the sincerity of Derek's words. Then, finally, one of the humans stepped forward, a woman with striking gray eyes and an aura of quiet authority. She spoke in a calm, almost detached tone. "You don't understand," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "This war isn't something that can be won with firepower alone. It's not something that can be fought with the old rules. We've been preparing because we have no choice. Our species, our entire civilization, was built with this in mind. It's why we don't trust anyone else. We couldn't risk showing our true strength." Derek's brow furrowed. "You're telling me you've been fighting this war alone?" The woman nodded. "From the beginning. You see, the enemy we're facing, it doesn't care about power or resources. It only cares about erasing life. Entire civilizations wiped out, one by one. It's not a species. It's not an army. It's something older, something much more dangerous. And it's coming." Derek felt a chill run through him. He had fought in wars, real wars with real enemies. But this was something else. The weight of the woman's words settled deep within him. The war wasn't just a matter of resources or dominance. It was about survival, about the very existence of life in the galaxy. And humanity had been preparing for this alone. They had been waiting for this threat, and now they were facing the truth. "Why didn't you ask for help?" Derek asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Why go through this alone?" The woman's eyes softened, just for a moment. "Because no one else would believe us. We knew that if we showed our full capabilities, the galaxy would see us as a threat, not as allies. They would try to conquer us, not fight beside us. And so, we kept our strength hidden, waiting for the moment when we couldn't keep it secret anymore." Derek realized how much he had misjudged humanity. He had thought they were weak, isolated, perhaps even irrelevant in the grand scheme of the galaxy. But now he saw the truth. Humanity had been preparing for the end of the galaxy itself, and their silence, their solitude, had been a shield, not to protect themselves from others, but to protect the galaxy from an extinction-level threat no one else was prepared to face. "Now we know," Derek said, his voice somber. "Now we understand. You were right to prepare alone." The room was quiet for a long moment, and then the woman spoke again. "We don't have much time. The war has already begun, and the enemy is closer than you think. You need to decide, Commander. Will you stand with us, or will you stand aside as we fight for our survival?" Derek stood in silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He had always been the predator, the conqueror. But now, faced with the reality of what was coming, he knew that this was no longer a fight for domination. It was a fight for life itself. And for the first time, Derek realized that sometimes survival required more than just strength. It required unity, courage, and the willingness to change. "We'll fight with you," Derek said, his voice resolute. "We'll stand with you." And with that, the raiders, once the hunters, became the allies of humanity. Together, they would face the unknown enemy, and together, they would fight for the future of the galaxy. The alliance between humanity and the raiders, once a distant thought, had now become a harsh, undeniable reality. The two forces, vastly different in their ways, now stood side by side in the face of a threat greater than either had ever imagined. For the first time in history, the raiders found themselves on the same side as the humans, fighting not for conquest, but for survival. It was an uncomfortable partnership, but in the cold, vast expanse of space, it was the only chance either species had. The first step was the creation of a unified command, a structure that would allow the two species to work together. Derek, the leader of the raiders, had earned his position as commander, but even he knew that the humans, with their advanced technology and tactical experience, would play a key role in any coordinated effort. At the head of the human forces was Commander Ilara, a woman whose cool demeanor belied the fierce determination that burned inside her. She had lived through years of preparing for this war, and now, as the enemy closed in, she had no choice but to rely on allies, strange, unsettling allies. The first briefing was a stark reminder of the threat they all faced. Gathered in a darkened room aboard a massive human warship, the commanders of both sides stood around a holographic map, studying the images of distant planets and moons. On the surface, the data appeared unremarkable. Stars, orbits, and distant systems, but Derek could see the tension in Ilara's posture. The closer the enemy came, the harder it was for her to hide the fear in her eyes. "Commander," Ilara said, turning to Derek, "this is what we've managed to piece together from the last few transmissions from the Outer Rim. The enemy we're facing is unlike any species we've encountered. We've been calling it the Oblivion. It's not a race, not a fleet. It's an entity, something that seems to exist as a force more than a form. It moves through space, consuming entire systems, erasing them from existence." Derek watched as Ilara zoomed in on a series of planets, each one marked with a faint blue glow. The glow was not a signal, but the last trace of life, faint remnants of civilizations that had been wiped from the stars. "Systems go silent before the enemy even arrives," Ilara continued. "Entire fleets have disappeared, their last transmissions reduced to static. All we know is that the Oblivion doesn't need armies or weapons. It consumes. It erases." Derek's heart tightened. The raiders had been hunters all their lives. They understood warfare, they understood tactics. But they didn't know how to fight something like this. Something that didn't leave behind bodies, didn't wage battles in the way they understood. The realization hit him. This was not a war of strategy. This was a war of existence. What can we do? Derek asked, his voice heavy. How do you stop something that erases entire worlds? Ilara met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. We don't stop it. We survive it. We survive by fighting together. We've built weapons, yes, but this isn't about technology. This is about understanding the enemy and outsmarting it. Derek didn't fully understand what she meant, but he knew the gravity of her words. The raiders weren't the only ones who had underestimated humanity. They had spent centuries perfecting their strategy to survive. And now, it seemed the rest of the galaxy had underestimated them too. Humanity's strength was not in its weapons, but in its ability to adapt, to think outside the box, to survive the impossible. The plan was simple. Humanity and the raiders would launch a joint offensive, targeting key systems that the Oblivion had yet to touch. The objective was not to defeat the enemy in a traditional sense, but to buy time. Time for humanity to learn more, to adapt further, to find a weakness. The raiders would help protect the humans, using their ships and tactics to safeguard critical resources and keep the enemy at bay. But even as Derek agreed to the plan, doubts lingered. Could they truly outsmart an enemy that didn't need to fight, that could simply erase them from existence? And even more troubling, how much longer would humanity be able to maintain this charade of strength before they, too, fell under the pressure? The alliance began to take shape over the next few weeks. Raiders and humans worked together, sharing knowledge, resources, and strategies. But the true test came when they received reports from one of the human scouting vessels. The Oblivion had made its move. A system on the edge of the galaxy had gone silent. Entire planets had vanished. No warning, no communication. It was as if the enemy had simply erased them from the stars. Derek and Ilara exchanged a grim look. The time for plans and strategy had passed. The war was here. It was no longer about winning. It was about surviving long enough to find a way to stop the Oblivion. The raiders, once confident in their ability to conquer and control, were now thrust into a situation they had never been prepared for. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. But this time, they weren't facing another species or rival empire. They were facing something far more terrifying. An enemy that didn't care about power, that didn't care about resources. An enemy that only wanted one thing, to erase everything in its path. As the raiders and humans prepared for battle, Derek's mind was filled with the chilling thought. What if they were already too late? The Oblivion wasn't like any enemy they had faced before. It was something primal, something ancient, and it was coming for them all. The only question now was whether they would be able to stop it before there was nothing left to save. But there was no turning back now. The two forces had united, and there was only one option left. Fight. Fight until they could fight no more, or die trying.